I'm, as say my friends, embassy, informal embassy of informal ambassador of informal embassy. It's, you know, it is a house of free peoples of Russia, as I say, Free Russia House, and every Friday we have discussions with our guests. Today I want to introduce you my friend, a professor from New Jersey, Rutgers University, Sergei Erofeev. He was a famous professional musician in Russia, then became a sociologist, and he was vice president of High School of Economics in Russia. And today he is president of Russian American Scientists here in USA. Is right? And I invite him today for a presentation of his very interesting theme. Как это называется? So, sorry. Putin's faulty machine, the sociology of the mafia state. And listen him, and after it, you can ask all your questions. And Ilya, my friend, will be moderator and help me.
Новосибирск мафия.
Да. He was member of Russian Parliament as I too. He from Novosibirsk too, but his English much better than mine. Sorry. So let's go.
Thank you very much, Arkady. Thank you, the Free Peoples of Russia House, for inviting me here. It's taken some time. I think it was maybe 8 or 7 months ago when we started to talk about this possibility for me to come and speak about what interests me.
Inception of the house.
Maybe, yes. And I should say that historically, I'm not connected to this initiative. And I've been critical of this initiative. If you ask me what I support among the larger network of Russian so-called opposition, but I deny that there is the thing called opposition, I would rather side with people like Ilya Yashin, Yulia Navalnaya, Vladimir Kara-Murza, the Free Russia Foundation in this city. And so I can be critical of certain things. If you will have questions why I'm so critical of your initiative, I can answer those questions. And at the same time, I understand that the initiative is one thing. The building, the institution is something else. And yet another thing is people. All people are different. Most people, the absolute majority, want the good for their country, want the good for the world. And they try to do certain things towards that goal. And they want to act together, which is very, very difficult, especially when there is no opposition. Just one little remark, why there is no opposition in Russia? Because it's very simple from the point of view of social sciences. In order to have opposition, one has to have political life within the country, competitive political environment. There's no such thing in Russia now. But there are people who represent aspirations of ordinary Russians towards democracy, and more than that, liberal democracy. And these people are to be called, more scientifically, resistance. So by all means, I'm promoting the idea of Russian resistance. And this resistance is very diverse, contradictory, but I see a great potential among those people who represent different parts of this resistance. And what is very important for this resistance to gain momentum is for the Western policymakers and broader Western civil society to understand better what is going on. The degree of that understanding has been increasing, but extremely slowly. One particular example of how very slowly the understanding of the nature of Putin's rule and Putin's war has changed to the better is the French President Macron. During Q&A, I can explain why it is a good example of that. But there are ups and downs, despite the general trajectory towards better understanding, and it's still very far from what I would like to see as a social scientist. As a social scientist, I have a mission. On the one hand, to show how things can be complicated about Russia, about Putin's power, and about the world affairs around that. At the same time, I aim to explain that things are not at all that complicated as they sometimes are portrayed. And this is what my presentation is about. That's why the organizers, I should probably thank Evgeny, who suggested the word faulty. I'm grateful for introducing this into my title. That's how it's modified today from my previous talks. Well, I'm going to talk about this faulty war machine. Understanding these faults is critical, not to picture some great and terrible sorcerer or magician in the Kremlin, but to understand his behavior from the point of view of a social science whose task is to understand behavior. International relations, economic science, political science even, sometimes don't go far enough in understanding the roots of certain behavior. In that sense, what I'm going to talk about is not only just a sociology, it's cultural sociology. If we understand by culture a system of values and a system of reactions, a system of behavioral elements, and even more than that, we'll dare say that we can sometimes characterize this type of analysis as a sort of zoology. So you should understand how one social group differs from the other. In a way, it's a little bit dehumanizing because we are trying to be very objective and get away from some personal traits and think more in terms of groups, maybe even species, like in zoology. But this is a very fine balance. On the one hand, we want to be very objective and minimize the individual factor and talk more about social processes, institutions, and wider mechanisms. On the other hand, it's very important to still remember that individuals play a role. And the controversial today's world is especially full of these new prompts, so to speak, for us to understand the nature of modernity. We all have been living through a long process, centuries-long process of modernization. And modernity is a promise to every one of us, every one of you, a promise of prosperity. Prosperous should be exactly everyone, representatives of any social stratum, any social group. That's how the discourse of human rights has developed. That's how new social strata were enfranchised from century to century, from decade to decade. First men without huge possessions, then women, then various minorities, etc., etc. So this is a long and very complex process which is full of discontent. Once upon a time, Sigmund Freud wrote one of the last works, which is called Culture and Its Discontent. Culture is violence. Every child experiences that violence from the early years, because the child has to be taught manners, the child has to go to school, etc., etc. We have to learn how to live with that and stop thinking about violence, but think about the benefits of that. Modernity also is connected with violence, despite this promise of prosperity and equality. There is a lot of literature about that, but the discussion of modernity somehow subsided in the last decades. I would like to rehabilitate the discourse of modernity, because every big problem in today's world revolves around that. Take, for example, the Middle East. Modernity benefits some people more than the others. Some people feel that discontent of modernity. They feel that they experience violence and injustice. And you can endlessly explain that there is a horrible Hamas who just is the main root of the problems in the Middle East. But more than that, there is the problem of this discontent and the inequality in accessing the promise of modernity. Some people really benefit from that, build almost a paradise on earth. Next door to that, there are people who are deprived of that. And we can't just say that they are politically inactive, or Russians are so slave-like that they haven't overthrown Putin. The real life is much more complicated. So that's the context within which we are talking about individual and groups, individual and broader society. So we can easily forget, especially after so many decades of developing procedures in the Western liberal democratic world, and where chancellors, prime ministers, presidents play not such a big role anymore. So we sometimes hear complaints, oh, there's no more Margaret Thatcher, or there's no more Ronald Reagan. The reality is that our perception of this role of individuals is changing. And not only the perception, the role of individuals is also changing. Who is Mr. Putin? This question was the most popular question in 2000. And still, many people don't have an answer to that question, because he's such a minuscule individual. Someone like in the Russian translation of the communist song called International, who was nothing became everything. So he was nothing, and suddenly became everything, or almost everything, so that we actually blow it out of proportions, our understanding who is Mr. Putin. So this is all complicated, but at the same time, I just repeat, my task is to explain where it is not complicated. And I already mentioned zoology and cultural sociology. Just look at this picture. These two creatures are very similar, aren't they? But this, called ichthyosaur, went extinct in the end of Mesozoic. So after the asteroid hit the Earth, they no longer existed. On the right, you see a creature which is very, very similar, but it's a mammal. More than a mammal, it's a mammal who first was a cow. After sea creatures came to the surface and evolved into mammals, some of these mammals became cows. Some of these cows decided, oh, I've got enough of that living on this earth. There's too many dangers and few opportunities. Let's return to the ocean. That's how they became dolphins. So this evolution is full of transformations. And this evolution reminds us that we should understand the difference in the nature. We can't really explain who is there in front of us if we don't dig slightly deeper, go into a kind of zoology. That's very important when you try to answer questions like this. Would Vladimir Putin attack NATO? If you use sociological means, if you study Putin's culture sociologically, the system to which he belongs, the system of values, your answer will be very clear. He will not. or we should make unimaginable mistakes in order for Putin to attack NATO. The other interesting question is, will Putin engage in cause an all-out nuclear Armageddon? The scientific answer to that, no way. No way at all. Or maybe small tactical nuclear strikes in the fields of Ukraine. The answer remains the same, no way. The only way the red button can be pushed, if you are serious about the arguments of cultural sociology, the only possibility is that Putin will commit nuclear suicide, killing himself and maybe some thousands of people around him. Again, something of that will be left for Q&As, or if I finish my main part a bit earlier, I will show a couple more slides. So I'll try to go very quickly through the main arguments, which should take us away from simplifications like this. You laugh at as if it's really new for you, but the Russians have lived with that already for a long time, and Ukrainians, thinking of Putin, laughingly of course, as a descendant of birth tyrants. But behind this satire, behind this hyperbolic depiction, there is a real horror, existential horror. What this creature can do to us, this little nothing who got hold of the red button and launched the war in Ukraine, which had seemed unimaginable just not long before it started. In connection to this misinterpretation of Putin as great and terrible, we hear all the time, like from the colleagues from the Atlantic Council, with which I have collaborated, Putin's history lecture reveals his dreams of a new Russian empire. My argument is very simple. Putin is not imperialist. Putin doesn't dream of territorial conquest. Putin doesn't care about Ukrainians. They are not his enemies. I'll tell you even more than that. Even Americans are not Putin's enemies. Even Americans, he doesn't care very much about. On the other hand, he uses all these images and words and references and imperial rhetoric in order to pursue his main goal. And the main goal is to stay in power. That's why the war started. It was not to conquer Ukraine. It was to avoid the major conflict with his own population, which would unavoidably bring him down. And this is something which he fears beyond any measure. And I'll explain why. So, old-fashioned colonial war of imperial conquest is a part of that discourse, which we hear in the city all the time, and even in Europe, which is very, very misleading. We are putting the cart in front of the horse. Мы ставим телегу впереди лошади. This way. There are things which have been done in our social science years and decades ago, which explain what has happened in Russia. And one important figure here is Vadim Volkov, the sociologist who is probably still the most quoted sociologist of post-Soviet Russia. He uses the word violent entrepreneurs. Those who pursued in the 1990s and after the main goal of self-enrichment and group enrichment. And for that, they used violence. Well, you can react immediately. That's what we saw throughout history. That's how the first barons came to power, first kings, etc. Yes, but there are modern mechanisms in the conditions of new market economy in Russia where violent entrepreneurs flourished. But as a result which affects the political and social system in Russia is the merger of two important things. One is organized crime, which is rooted in old Soviet practices, including the legacy of the Gulag, and the other is corrupt law enforcement. Some analysts, particularly I had a little fight, but I didn't really fight, but she fought me. Her name is Evgenia Albats, the famous Russian journalist, who still holds that the whole system of Russian rule by Putin is built exclusively on FSB and KGB practices. I argue contrary to that. I try to show that the most powerful secret service in Russia has been adapted to the needs of something else, of the culture which captured the state, including FSB, including KGB, and started to use some of their methods. But the underlying values and the underlying methods are not those of KGB. They transformed. They became a part of it. So organized crime and corrupt law enforcement and governance. So their convergence has resulted in the mafia takeover of the state in Russia. So mafia is another word which very often value-loaded. And therefore, why the audience says it's not considered to be an academic term. My task is to show that this is not the case. This is exactly an academic term to explain the nature of Putin's rule and therefore Putin's war. What happened with Russia in the early 2000s? Roughly what was described by Stalin's henchman, Roman Rudenko, who was the prosecutor for the USSR, the Nuremberg trial. He said famously, he's been quoted many times, for the first time, criminals who captured an entire state and made the state itself an instrument of their monstrous crimes stand trial. So criminals captured the state. But there is a very big but here. Hitler represented new ideology. He was a part of the modernist outlook into the future. And it was a party system and not a mafia system. It was not a culture in the form of criminal groups. They acted as criminals and became the world's most famous criminals, of course. But the whole mechanism was absolutely different. But it's important to remember that the whole state can be captured by some group. And everything in the state and in social life turns to the service of this group. Similar thing happened in Russia, but there's a huge, huge difference. That's why equating Putin and Hitler would be nonsensical if we really want to explain the mechanisms that are at work here. This is Putin's system. Putin's system of power, Putin's rule. I represent here some concentric circles. So at the very core of his system is the mafia itself. You can call it lake cooperative ozera. The most neatly, tightly woven small circle of people. Those on whom Putin depends more than many can imagine. So he works for them to remain powerful and rich. And this is really how it works within these cultures of honor as opposed to cultures of dignity. Ancient, archaic, anachronistic cultures which use the asymmetry in the modern social texture. So they use the vulnerabilities of modernity because modernity is very complex. And if you have something very different from that, not complex but simple and very unified and pointed in a certain direction, then you can act asymmetrically to undermine the modern social texture, or more than that, capture what you need and turn it into your instrument. It's a parasitic approach. So there is something which is flourishing, there is a rich cow, good milk, good meat, but you know how to behave as a parasite, to live on that. live off that. So that's the very center, mafia core. What is the next? The next is without which no modern complex society cannot exist. Not America, not Russia. Russia is, whatever you say critically, is a modern society in many ways. First of all, because it has modern bureaucracy and it has procedures, including, by the way, the procedures of elections. Putin's rule is absolutely impossible without some nascent basic elements of democratic order in Russia. Putin is in power only because he was elected by people. And still now, almost everybody who is on Putin's side, they think that they are not simply ruled by Putin, but he's someone whom they elected. And if they want so, or if the situation changes, they will change their mind. They will elect someone else. But it so happens that now we continue to vote for him. That's what is the important part of those people's behavior. So corrupt bureaucracy, millions of people, including those wearing epaulets, including secret service, including law enforcement, police, investigating committee, prosecutors, etc. But not only that, chief doctors, the chief administrators of hospitals, directors of public schools, rectors of universities, etc., etc. This is not simply bureaucracy, it's corrupt bureaucracy. Corruption here should be understood in broader sense, not just as practicing bribes, giving and taking bribes. Corruption in a broader sense is worsening of institutions, perverting those modernist practices that should serve the interests of everyone, so that they less serve the interests of everyone and more serve the interests of this mafia core. So that's corrupt bureaucracy, absolutely essential element. This is the backbone of any state in our modern society. In Russia, it's no exception, but it can get absolutely corrupt. We know that corruption is like cancer cells. It exists in any organism. Every one of us, no single person in this room is absolutely free of cancer cells. The question is, how many cancer cells? In Russia, as we know, and Alexei Navalny tried to explain it to as many people as possible, that corruption becomes the fundamental principle of societal organization under certain conditions. And the outer circle is the indoctrinated population of Russia. You can't continue with this power system without indoctrinating those people. Here I may have a very important reservation to make. Putin is fighting on three fronts. One is in Ukraine, of course. The other is trying to fight the people of goodwill everywhere in the world, Western progressive policymakers, etc. Those who can fight back with sanctions, for example. And the third front is his own people, the oldest front. And the front because of which the other two fronts exist. And Putin has failed on the Ukrainian front. It became clear already in the spring 2022. Plan A, as I call it, Putin's blitzkrieg, failed. That's why he proceeded to Plan B, protracted war. By definition, protracted war should drag on and on endlessly, possibly, because this is exactly what helps Putin to stay in power. So he failed there. He also failed with the Russian people. Even the governmental pollsters show that there is no overwhelming support of Putin's rule and Putin's war. Definitely not of Putin's war. People are against military mobilization. People are afraid of going back to the Soviet times of deficit. They are only content with the existing situation because there is still market economy, which is flexible, which helps survive both Putin's system to circumvent sanctions, for example, and the ordinary people who still have their cars, their dachas, they have their private property, they can sell their apartments, buy other apartments. So this is extremely important. These people haven't turned into Putinists or fascists or elements of totalitarian machine. It's impossible simply because it's a consumer society. And everybody in Russia would like to live like people in Europe. Just the discourse of Europeanization has been suppressed and severely suppressed. So that's the second failure for Putin. The only success Putin has achieved on a serious scale is trying to persuade the West, people like you, and those you elect, and not elected officials too, like ministers of foreign affairs. He has managed to persuade many of them that he's what? That it's not just his war, and that he's supported by the Russian people. Again, even Putin's pollsters show that it's not the case. One just has to read those polling data carefully and with certain preparation. So that's the system as it is, institutionally. But let's turn to the role of the individual in our late modernity. Putin wants to stay in power forever. It became clear after his the beginning of his second term. It became clear in 2005 in his internal communication with his government and the people, which materialized in a new form in his Munich speech in 2007. Because he started to employ anti-Westernist discourse. Why? Because he was afraid to leave his post. And of course, in 2008, when he let his seat warmer, Dmitry Medvedev, to be president for 4 years, it was absolutely clear that he's trying to do something with the constitution without changing that yet to come back to power. And that's how we came to the turbulent winter of 2011, 2012. So he wants to stay in power more and more and more because he knows, like with any deviant, that the more he stays in power, the more crimes he commits, the greater will be the retribution. And the understanding of retribution for Putin is very primitive, very archaic. Just look at the Russian prisons. Look at the famous anal rape which happens in the Russian prisons on mass scale. You can even call those broomsticks Putin broomsticks, which are used for anal rape on that scale. So he's afraid of that. He's afraid of NDR like Muammar Gaddafi being torn apart because he doesn't believe in modern justice, liberal democratic justice. He is seriously afraid that once he loses his power after he caused so many deaths of children of Beslan, people in Chechnya, etc., and then his attack on Georgia, and then the year 2014. So the longer it lasts, the more it resembles the behavior of those well-established deviants who, in order to conceal their crime, let's call it rape crime, they decide to kill the victim. So you first rape, then you kill, and then you try to stay where you are forever, because change of that situation leads to retribution. Like, he can even imagine things like flaying or impaling, huge public humiliation. There is one famous Siberian, not so famous unfortunately, Teplяков from Krasnoyarsk, I think, who published the book called The Procedure, who explained the culture of those lower classes recruited by NKVD, Stalin's secret police, to control the masses and implement repressions. So in order to achieve Stalin's goals, he led those people through multiple layers of command, of course, to not only execute people, not only kill, but to beat them up severely before shooting them. And this really goes back to archaic cultures when you don't only physically destroy or nearly kill your opponent, you have to pee on them. So you have to add insult to injury on a mass scale. So this is what really is the core of Putin's main motivation to stay in power. This is the absolute fundamental thing. Not vanity, not the desire to stay in history, remain in history as a great restorer of the Russian Empire. Not someone who would like the life of Russians better. He cares about that within his so-called impression management, trying to deceive you. The fear of retribution is the absolute foundation of this pyramid. Only the second comes pursuit of domination. And the pursuit of domination, which is very characteristic for alpha males and youth gang leaders and copy everywhere. So domination is extremely important because this holds the culture together. The culture which brought you here and which helps you to stay here where you are, maintains your status quo. So pursuit of domination is more important than even the pursuit of wealth. Talking about the pursuit of wealth, Alexei Navalny and his team spent a lot of energy and time, which was very, very important. The answer is very simple. Why? Because the general Russian public wouldn't quite understand why should we care about Putin's fear of retribution or pursuit of domination. The easiest way of changing the political practices and introduce some competition in Russian political life was pointing out that those guys only care about money. But even that is more important for Putin than his vanity. So one should remember about that. This is extremely important. How it becomes evidence-based, that's exactly why cultural sociology is needed. So the remainder of this will be about that. Economic sociology approach. Again, Vadim Volkov in 2003 published this book called Violent Entrepreneurs, where he talks about the dual function of the racket. It's, of course, not terribly original. In this country, there was a great sociologist called Charles Tilly. What is this dual function? You have to manufacture threats in order to offer protection services. You think it's only ordinary mafiosi do that? Organize, engage in racket activities, racketeering activities? No. Historically, maybe early governments did that, but not so obviously as now, when mafia has captured the state and manufactures artificial threats in order to offer protection services. It started within the late 1990s, early 2000s merger between organized crime and corrupt bureaucracy and law enforcement in Russia. But it became state policy. It became a state international policy in Russia. We know that Putin has been trading fear and corruption for a long time. And gradually, but he brought about this discourse of evil West as a manufactured threat. And now he has to offer protection against that threat. So it's just all classical logic. The other important person is Svetlana Stevenson, who later in 2015 published the book called Gangs of Russia. Reminds you of the famous movie, of course. Gangs of Russia, from the streets to the corridors of power. You can say, из подворотен в коридоры власти. Because where was Putin? Where did he grow up? As an underclass? He wasn't even a working class guy. He was underclass. In the streets of St. Petersburg. В подворотне, literally. There are multiple possibilities to talk about his psychological problems and complexes growing from that. Feeling weak, unprotected, that's why he decided to join KGB, of course. Not only practicing judo, but even better, becoming a KGB officer. She actually conducts, Svetlana Stevenson, she conducts a linguistic analysis of the language of Putin and his inner circle. Before me, there was another presenter, I believe, who analyzed Putin's language. But really, if you want to understand Putin's role in Putin's war, it's important to turn to Svetlana Stevenson. Putin's language is familiar to you, I guess. Whoever slights us will not live 3 days. Кто нас обидит, не проживет и 3 дней. Snuff them out in the latrines. Мочить в сортир. But if you're part of the not necessarily very inner circle of Putin, but the next close circle, like the Russian foreign minister Sergei Lavrov, you can be an intelligentsia boy like former President Medvedev, but you have to adapt to that. You have to play that game. And it becomes kind of your inner self. In sociology, it has been explained in the 1960s how one becomes a drug user. So it's a certain mechanism of learning how to become something else in your life. So Lavrov, whether he's an intelligentsia guy indeed or not, he uses the expressions like «пацан сказал, пацан сделал». The lad said, the lad did. Such понятия should be respected at the international level as well. So this brings us to the studies of deviant culture. Deviant culture study of deviant culture is a very long tradition. First of all, in American sociology. Понятия, notions, пацан's code, values and norms, as tools serving the gang's interests. The word is the Kremlin fenya, the slang, jive, criminal jargon. So she explains this fenya as a cultural foundation for these people. As in other traditional honor cultures, понятия include the need to dominate in any situation, the principle of unity of word and action, the requirement to take responsibility for one's words. So I'm the master of my word. But at the same, these people, they never admit to any mistakes, as we know. It's very important because you are not part of culture of dignity, you're part of culture of honor. Honor culture is very archaic. The Western liberal democracies have overcome that. Loyalty to fellow gang members and no real obligation to those who do not belong to the gang. So it's how you better describe archaic cultures. These are the gopniki. I lived in a city with a very strong gopnik culture in the city of Kazan. About that city is this famous movie, Slovo Patsana, the lad's word, blood on the sidewalk. That's what they looked like. And this appeal, emotional appeal to Patsan culture, to Gopniki culture, Gopnik is a thug, just minor gang member. They even promoted this imagery in preparation to the 2024 presidential elections in Russia. I don't have time to show this, but maybe later. Well, I don't know how I start this because, okay. I can't turn on these subtitles. Why do you come to our office? So you make your choice. Be independent, be a man, be a patsan. So, which means vote for Putin. Don't be Chushpan. Chushpan is nobody for Gopnik, for the lad. So this is seeking protection from the gang. An intelligentsia boy who speaks English and plays the piano gets into trouble, so he decides to join the gang in Kazan. So a little bit of military organization, as you know, paramilitary. Gopniks, Patsani never apologize. Pindosi are Americans, so Americans are not going to tell us what to do.
And they are apologizing.
Yeah. So don't. So those who really choose in this life are Patsani, are the lads. This is the.
But translate the last thing that was there. That's important.
Yeah. Пацаны кочумают.
No. It was on the screen. So we, after your movies, will come to elections.
Oh yes, of course, yes.
Don't be Chushpan.
Yeah.
Kazan, you know?
Come and vote.
Be elect.
So you
Come to
pretend that
election.
there is a real campaign,
So
there
that's
is a
unusual.
procedure. You really depend on this procedure. Putin will not continue to rule the country if there is no procedure. But you have to play around this procedure and you have to persuade that you should be like Patsani, like those strong young gang members. That was the 1970s and 80s. Actually, many think that this culture flourished in the 1990s. It's not true. It's much earlier. Not even in the 80s, but it started in the 1970s. I personally knew 3 boys in my city of Kazan who were stabbed to death in the streets of Kazan, of my city. This is a very funny cat. Yeah. Or being in between.
Explain what it was, because I think that many of our American friends do not know.
Oh, the Kazan phenomenon.
It's an phenomenon.
Well, it's actually wrong sociologically to say it was unique. It was not only Kazan phenomenon. Tatarstan, Kazan is the capital of Tatarstan, but it was typical for many major cities where the old extended family no longer existed. Parents will be very, very busy, like it happened with Putin. There was no family education for Putin at all. It was street education.
But important that it's happened at the end of the Soviet Union was the last years of the Soviet Union, and many of those people became then the foundation of the new market economy.
That's exactly what is on the right. In the 1990s, there was a very important transition from Patsani. Patsani is a self-description, okay? Ascription would be Gopniki. It's kind of derogatory. We call them thugs, Gopniki. Patsani is a very respectful to yourself thing. So, like, you're almost knights, like knights, where really honor people. Yeah. Very prestigious mink hats. Only very, very few could afford mink hats at that time. But that's the 1980s. Here in the 1990s, the magenta jacket and the thick golden chain signify so-called new Russians. We already forgot that expression. New Russians started to be very visible exactly under the conditions of market economy. So those who were Patsani before, they understood much better the promise of this new market environment than the traditional vory of Zakonie. So thieves in law, former Soviet and Gulag thieves in law, horrified, criminal lords of the past, they really didn't ever want to participate with the state. These guys knew that under the new market conditions, it's the key to their prosperity, to cooperate with the state. And maybe, as we will see later, become part of the state. So here, in the 1990s, they started to really infiltrate the economy. And Vadim Volkov has a brilliant article where he describes Uralmashevsky. the former thugs from the city of Yekaterinburg, who in the 1990s really took every advantage of the burgeoning market economy. And they became first these new Russians, but then they started to participate in major economic enterprises, and then started to get involved into political life. You can say that they became local oligarchs. Well, oligarch is the other word, which is very misleading. There are no oligarchs in Russia anymore. Oligarchs can exist only in specific environment where they can exert their independent influence on certain processes. So what we have now in Russia are not oligarchs. They're Putin's wallets or Putin's pockets. Even those who belong to the old former oligarchs like Deripaska, for example. So that's to be remembered that in the 1990s there was an important evolution joining the economy. And this should really lead us away from this misinterpretation and temptation to think of Putin as great and terrible. The mechanism of becoming who he is very simple. He was just part of that. So when, for example, Angela Merkel says that Putin is out of touch with reality, the scientific answer to that is no, he's not out of touch with reality. He has his own reality. And this is a reality which is quite serious, which affects many people, unfortunately. So that's how decision makers in the West and leading politicians have developed this misleading discourse, and how we found ourselves where we are with this war and the impotency to stop that war right away. Because we have to really admit that President Biden did everything not to let Ukraine win, because he was afraid of nuclear escalation. Of course, we should be grateful to the collective West for backing Ukraine and helping the way they could, but too many things just follow the principle, too little, too late. That's how this Pachan in power, now capo di tutti capi, Pachan всех паханов, I would say in Russian. It's a very good Russian translation of capo di tutti capi, Pachan всех паханов. That's how he lives. He wants to live in absolute luxury, with his understanding of what is beauty of this life. Сделайте мне красиво. It was described by Mayakovsky when he wrote about the new economic policy bourgeoisie in the early Soviet Union in the 1920s. So various parts of the country and even various parts of the world, he has villas, he has official residences, non-official residences, yachts, property abroad, this unbelievably tasteless Gelendzhik Palace, the most expensive palace in the history of humankind, which just the stones alone cost at least $1 billion, but how much you pay to maintain it and to rebuild it as it happened. So I would like to draw your attention to this phenomenon. It's a very important signifier within this culture, and so we better understand this culture. You know, these objects can have different functions. One may wonder if Putin's Gelendzhik Palace, not discovered by Navalny, but beautifully described by Navalny to wider audiences around the moment of his arrest upon his return from Germany in January 2021. So, Patsani in power, they need intracultural regulation. You have to hold this plasma together in order for that to be efficient. And in order for you to stay in power, and in order for you and your group to exert power over various social groups. So one might think, maybe the whole idea of the palace would be just to be a state object. You are the president of a major country. You want to invite the American president, the Chancellor of Germany, etc., and talk politics with them in this palace, entertain them there, show how powerful your country is, how wonderful is the central palace of this country. No, he never did it, and he never planned. Economic value, economic function, was he ever going to invest into that and then sell it with profit? Of course not. Then maybe you think in 2007 when he started to build it, he thought about retiring and he needed some little dacha for himself. No, he was never going to retire there. Because first of all, we know he was never going to leave his post. So it's not a recreational object at all. There is no recreational function. The only function here is ritualistic. Something which keeps, through the ritual, those people of that mafia together. So it's cultural. Cultural, ritualistic. Members of his circle would bring gifts to this altar in order to show that this is the centerpiece around which their culture revolves. That this is something like an idol of their existence. And Putin is the main keeper of that. So like with the Russians in magenta jackets, the most magenta jacket should be worn by the Kapadi Tutikapi, by the Pakhan. Other are also magenta jackets. And in fact, you have to have them. You have to show how rich and corrupt you are. You have to have a business jet. You have to have villas abroad. You have to have many other things, yachts. But of course, the Pakhan, всех Pakhanov, his objects would be exceptional. And they are the ritualistic center of maintaining this culture active. And of course, all around that, you know how specific Putin's lifestyle is. He wants to have cryogenic chambers, baths, in most of his residences in order to live as long as possible, possibly forever. Because this is a life, first of all, so wonderful in various riches, but it's also so wonderful because you dominate. And it's so wonderful because the opposition to that, the alternative to that, is to die horrible death, unimaginably horrible and humiliating death. So you better live forever, if possible. Hire some geneticists, for example, stem cell specialists, build a special biological institute affiliated with Moscow State University and governed by his daughter, in order to bring all the resources. And this reminds us of Brezhnev in the 1970s, when he famously said, «Все во имя человека, все для блага человека». Everything in the man's name, everything is for the good of the man. And the joking Soviet response, popular response would be, and we know who is that man, meaning Brezhnev. But now we have a much more adverse case of that. All of this is done for the sake of one man, because the system is extremely personalistic. Extremely personalistic, absolutely personalistic. He thinks that he needs and deserves all of that. Dozens of residences with dozens of cryogenic baths, and he deserves, these baths in wild animal blood, going to Siberia, engaging in shamanistic practices as well. So it's a very funny mix. There's nothing of Christianity here, but quite possibly a good deal of some primitive religious beliefs. So cultural сверхзадача, if we recall Konstantin Stanislavski, the famous director, and his method, super objective of the actor. In his case, for Putin and people like him, there is also a super objective. Like the actor should really be beyond his self or her self in order to be successful on stage. For Putin, conspicuous consumption should be excessive, and corruption is needed to sustain it. Conspicuous consumption has been described in sociology in the early 20th century by the American sociologist of Norwegian descent, Thorsten Veblen. He wrote about leisure class. But this is, that thing brought to absurdity. This becomes a very important element of ruling the country. The other thing is to live and rule for as long as possible, creating the popular sense that it will always be this way. So pretend to be like immortal pharaoh, or even if the pharaoh dies, he doesn't really die. Ensure loyalty through cultural means, intercultural regulation that I already mentioned. What helps us understand how it works? The idea of secondary deviance. I can't really dwell on that very long, but our science has explained that beautifully already. How first being a primary deviant, you become a secondary deviant. I already mentioned how you develop career of drug user. But you can be a drug user in the sense of using power and domination as well. You, in other words, say, лучше грешным быть, чем грешным слыть. It's better to be a sinner than to be rumored as one. So you start to capitalize on your criminal status. You become a secondary deviant. It becomes your inner self. Not just primary, like you steal a bicycle to impress your possible girlfriend, but you really become professional in that. You develop what we call career, criminal deviant career. And the other important thing is impression management. Toughness versus cowardice and negotiation, and again, conspicuous consumption. All right, so these are the two big names who have made a huge contribution to American and global sociology, studying deviant behavior and secondary deviance and impression management. Irving Goffman and Howard Becker. But there is a new approach which developed over the last maybe 8 years. First of all, thanks to a couple of Hungarian colleagues, Balint Magyar and Balint Madlovic. They explain what is mafia state. Mafia state is a state ruled by an adopted political family. It's not a real family. You create an artificial family. You can call it adopted family. Patrimonializing political power in a democratic environment. What means patrimonializing? Trying to explain the rest of the population that they're just children. They don't really understand as much. Let the big boys decide for you. They know what they're doing. So they create an artificial pater figure, father figure. He can never be admired and loved like Stalin or like Hitler. They just need to pretend that there is a father. And you, ordinary people, just do your business as usual. This war is somewhere far from you. And we know better why we engage in this war. But what is needed for this, of course, is a democratic environment. Without market economy and some basic democratic mechanisms, this patrimonialization and this capture of the state by mafia is simply impossible. So it's predatory. It's using this environment in predatory ways, routinely stepping over formal laws and operating the state as a criminal organization. So again, back to Rudenko and his description of Hitler. So the Nazis operated their state as a criminal organization. The same is true about Putin and his inner core. So the mafia state is a combination of a clan state, a neo-patrimonial state, a predatory state, and a criminal state. So there's some references to myself, and there is a very interesting article by Michael Waller and Freda Iresking called Nursing Injustices. It's a little bit tangent to my today's talk, but it's important because there are people who are not within the mainstream of American society. What they're actually doing, it's a kind of reductionism. They're trying to bring everything down to Putin's sexuality. That his, well, in particular his homophobia, is caused by his latent homosexuality. I wouldn't personally dwell too much on that he's trying to suppress that. and that his machismo is part of that. But what is important to remember here, that he has lots of injustices that he feels. He's nursing them. He always talks about being offended. We are offended. What is offended? Well, let's remember simple, obvious things, which are part of history now. That he was a weak and very insecure young man who decided to go and join gangs and join judo clubs and then KGB, etc. And then, when the market economy made it possible, he became the middleman between the state officials in St. Petersburg and the criminal world. So this is very much helping to overcome these injustices. Conceal who he really is, but we know that he always conceals who he really is. I personally, as a sociologist, don't care whether he's homosexual here or something else. The fact is that he's concealing a lot. He, of course, always has this excuse. Well, this is the great tradition of secret services. The KGB was an intelligence officer. Of course, he was not an intelligence officer in the full sense. He was a club director and someone who tried in Dresden to trade Western goodies through DDR to the Soviet Union. We have a lot of not only evidence from the past now, but some systematic. Artyom Kruglov, who has been successful with that. So what are the implications of all of that? The implications are actually extremely serious. Not in the sense that Putin is going to nuke us or to nuke at least Ukraine. There are three fronts, which I already mentioned. There are three fronts of this war. One element of that is the West, the democratic West, the free world, the people of goodwill, the decision makers in liberal democracies. What needs to be done? We need proactive arms supply, economic and political pressure on Putin in order to support the Ukrainian front. Ukraine is here. But there is also the other front. It's last but not least, by number, but not by importance. So number three is historically the first front, the Russians. In order to be efficient for the West in this direction, they should do everything to delegitimize Putin's rule. And the big fall, actually, that happened occurred in the late 2021, when Navalny was already in prison, and when every Western leader, before even talking about any Putin's ultimatum or Ukraine or something, you remember Putin's ultimatum of the end of lines? But they should have started any conversation. Wait, don't listen to him. Release Navalny. So this is just due response to the situation. The West continues to misinterpret Putin, in other words. So mafiosi in power always plays these games. Impression management, and always extorting respect. All Putin does with the West is trying to extort respect and to show that he's on the equal footing with everybody, whereas he's no way near Western democratic leaders. He's just a mafioso in power who should be ignored in certain respects. And we shouldn't give in to this fear of escalation. And those who surround Putin, why do they love the West? Because they want to be part of it. And the end goal of mafiosi is to have quiet, peaceful life, quiet, peaceful pursuit of respectability. Historically, the role of mafia in this country has gone down, as we know. Why? Because those old mafiosi, they wanted their children to become lawyers and doctors, etc., and politicians. Exactly because of that. because they are part of mobility. Modernity, they cannot exist without modernity. They want to capitalize on that. Parasitize and capitalize. So, and this impression management is throughout what we say about Putin. Some may say that it's only fear of COVID that caused Putin to sit so far away from Emmanuel Macron. But there's much more to that. It's a very ritualistic thing. It's trying to show that I can be late 3 hours for an appointment, but I can sit so far away. Always trying to indirectly put others down. Without that, this guy cannot exist. So what I wanted to conclude with, and if there would be just a minute, maybe 5 minutes, I will talk about suicide, the possibility of suicide. I really love this saying from Maria Skłodowska-Curie, the great double Nobel laureate from Poland originally. Nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less. It's time to understand the nature of Putin's rule and Putin's war. Okay, how can it all end? My perspective is cultural interactionist. If Putin is not removed from power by a palace coup or a military fiasco, he might do it himself by suicide. Not as a madman, but playing a role in a cultural interaction. So we have to remember, of course we remember Hitler, we remember Gaddafi, we remember Saddam, etc. Very often we say it will never happen that Ukrainian boots or American boots on the ground will bring them to the Kremlin and Putin will fall that way. He would more likely fall under the ruins of his own system. We don't need to send American soldiers to Russia, not even Ukrainian soldiers to Russia. I actually disagree that military defeat in Ukraine will immediately bring an end to Putin's rule. At the moment, he has enough resources for that. Okay, I will be too far. But the situation is in flux. And sooner or later, it's possible that he will be surrounded in his bunker by those who betray him. And of course, his worst enemies are active Russians and those potentially dangerous in his circle. Maybe even in the inner circle, because he's, after all, a lonely figure in the very center of a highly personalist system. So he can commit that suicide, but not like Hitler. Hitler committed suicide when he wanted the whole German nation to perish, because they betrayed the great ideal of National Socialism. Putin has no ideals. He has no ideology. All he wants is to stay in power forever and live beautiful life, possibly forever. But it doesn't mean totally ruling out any contempt of the Russian people. But he cannot ruin the whole country like Hitler would like to. And actually succeeded in that because of their live bombings. Putin can try and leave this world through the the only painless way of living this world. And, well, medical scientists have explained to us that the only painless suicide is to be in the very center of a nuclear explosion. He's not going to nuke Ukraine. He's not going to nuke the world and America. What he can do, he can use a tactical weapon, portable weapon, which only needs one button. No multiple security measures, no safety protocols. Just one button. You're in the very center of that. And it's so glorious. It's so theatrical. It's much better than Hitler. For Hitler, it was really horrible. Poisoning yourself, shooting yourself. No. This is unprecedented. This is the ultimate moment of Putin's vanity. If he pushes the button and evaporates before the signals from nervous ending will reach his brain. The most beautiful, painless death. Why? Let's turn to one of the classics, Emmy Durkheim, one of our founding fathers, became very popular because of this book, simply called Suicide. What is suicide, sociologically speaking? Many of us think this is the most intimate thing, which is unexplainable. It has nothing to do with society, with culture, with values. Durkheim explains the opposite. He says that even the most intimate act is socially conditioned. And the most extreme kind of deviance, it's my addition to Durkheim, the most extreme kind of deviant behavior is suicide. It's even more extreme than robbery or even mass murder, because you care about millions of people less than about yourself, in the case of Putin. So this is an interesting diagram, an interpretation of Durkheim's classification of suicides. So suicides and tendency to suicide depends on a couple of dimensions. Here, vertically, you can see integration. The more social integration, the more is the probability of altruistic suicide. That's how suicide bombers. They are too much integrated. They belong to the culture, which is more than them. Their cult of death is stronger than their desire to live, in the name of their group. So that's called altruistic suicide. We know that, even from modern history. Not to mention early Christianity. No, I shouldn't be saying Christianity because it was not suicide, but people were ready to die. Yeah, the opposite of that, egoistic suicide, when you are not enough integrated, when you feel that you are nobody, everybody hates you. More than that, you hate yourself. There is not enough integration. You're not part of anything. You're betrayed. That's where Putin's possibility of suicide lies. The other dimension is along regulation. So if there's not enough regulation, it's called anomic suicide. It's a typical Durkheimian term. Anomie means lack of rules and regulations. This happens sometimes when the country falls apart after a long war. People feel lost and they commit suicide. We know that after the First World War, for example, in Europe, when there's too much regulation, we call it fatalistic suicide. A very good example is a very severe prison condition. You can't escape. It's totally fatal. There's no sense to continue to live. So the prisoner kills herself within this fatalistic framework. So my argument would be the possibility of putting suicide lies there. It's harder to explain Hitler's suicide because there was a big ideology, big desire to be one big whole between the Führer and the folk. And the folk, this folk deserves to perish together with the Führer. Putin understands he can't do that, but he rather values painless death and also theatricality, which will allow to show his contempt and his feeling of desertedness and not belonging, that nobody loves me and I even hate myself. So it's more likely. Here I would like to probably conclude with the idea that not only society determines certain suicidal parameters that can affect the whole of society. And here comes the image of Chekhov's gun. What is Chekhov's gun? Weapons of mass destruction. So in his correspondence, famously Anton Chekhov, the Russian playwright, said, if in the very first act of a play there is a rifle hanging at the backdrop, then towards the end of this play it will shoot. So if there are weapons of mass destruction, what we fear, they will eventually be enacted. We don't have to live endlessly with just one case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. This is a serious problem. This is what really makes the knees of Western decision makers tremble. They're afraid of nuclear escalation. That's why it is important to explain that Putin is not going to nuke you. He can only nuke himself. Maybe he will kill some thousands of those who surround his bunker. Maybe many innocent Russians, but these Russians are not innocent. They betrayed him. They hate him, and he now has to hate himself. So we have to remember about that. And here, presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sergei, thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. I will ask you three, to me, most fundamental questions for understanding of your ideas, but I would leave the juicy part about suicidal tendencies and homosexuality of Putin for the audience. You know, I think that there will be people who are curious. Okay, please. So my first question was from what you started from. You were talking about the modernism, and to my mind, the modernist state, you were saying about Hitler, we can say the same thing about the Soviet Union. The current Russia is the country which elites are trying to use postmodernist approach to life, when nothing is serious, where form dominates the content, when you can do whatever and don't bear responsibility because it's all not serious. We can talk nuclear without intention to actually use it because, you know, we'll not be punished. You know, it's all about rhetorics. At the same time, they're trying to push the general public, the general population, more in the feudalism era, and with the mechanisms of inheriting power, you know, this new aristocracy 2.0, which is in Russia. And to me, it started not with Putin. It started after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This process of split, and it was originally engaged by those oligarchs, but the post-Soviet elites, not by gopniks. It's actually they became the beneficiaries of this, but it was started in the 1990s. And that's, you were starting to talking about the opposition, whatever. That's for me one of the biggest problems, is because I think that the majority of Russian liberal opposition also inherits from these same people who were anti-ideological, who were ideologicophobic. And that's the foundation of the current society. Would you agree to this? Or your opinion is different?
Well, it's a very important reservation that in the 1990s, the redistribution of the former socialist property started with so-called red directors. They were the first proto-oligarchs, and then some creative people from outside the party structures, like Boris Berezovsky, came into play, or some former Komsomol activists like Khodorkovsky. Some people would be ripping off the country more than other people. Some would come to understanding of the necessity of rules and norms, like Khodorkovsky came to understand in the early 2000s, when he was arrested by Putin because he started to practice modern transparent procedures in doing economy. But it's true, those people played a very important role. And it's not only the gopniks from the streets of St. Petersburg who came to the center of the power, but the very, very center of the power, if you think of Putin, is exactly that. And without that ethics of archaic street culture of gangsters, youth delinquency, secondary deviance, there would never be a possibility of merging organized crime and corrupt law enforcement. and corrupt bureaucracy and corrupt economic organization. So those people also understood how to achieve certain goals, circumventing not only democratic procedures, but also the rules of developed Western economies. They would gradually come to something like Khodorkovsky came. They would gradually agree that we should have more rules and try to work to the benefit of the entire society. And Russia could have moved towards the Scandinavian model of capitalism through that. But Russia, unfortunately, was not only a country, was not only a society, but was a state captured by the mafia, which I'm trying to describe. How is that?
Okay, I would love to elaborate more. It's just we're limited on time, but I would. My second question would be exactly where you just stopped with the mafia state and the corruption. One of my personal disputes with the person whom you mentioned many times during your presentation, Alexei Navalny, was that I don't believe that there is like ordinary people who are free of corruption and who don't know anything, and they need to be told how corrupt the elites are, and they would then rebel and destroy the elites. To me, and you're many times using a word mafia in Sicily, is something which actually engages all of the society. It's not just the gang itself, it's the society in general. And I think that in Russia exactly the same thing. It's the social lifts, they're actually incorporating more and more people within the mafia circles of power. Some people are dropping out, but some new recruits are coming, and among them the most youngest capable people, and they're willingly joining the ranks. And to me, Navalny's movies, they are watched not as, oh wow, we didn't know this, but it's more like celebrity's life, it's, in the Western culture. And many people think, wow, I want to live like this as well. It's not that it's awful and I don't want this. It's rather I want to be in their place, or I want to be part of this, or I want to join this. That's my personal experience during election campaigns. People know all this. They don't want to hear the news about the corruption. They're actually asking how to turn it to their benefit during the meetings. And понятие, this jargon that you were talking about, is universal for all of the society. 20% of Russians actually went through the prison system, penitentiary system, and so they are adopting this as well. And that's why this Slovo Patsana movie was a super hit among everybody. And that's why, there was this debate in our intellectual circles, is that Putin actually wanted this movie to be released. It was promoted. It was administration of the president, presidential staff, which says like, oh, that's a great movie. They were advertising it because that was the advertising of a certain lifestyle that people want to be involved. So these gangs of Russia, it's all of the society, it's not part of the society. Do you think, firstly, would you agree to what I was saying? And do you see there is any hope to overcome this situation?
Very important clarification is due about Navalny. Whereas I understand the limitation of Navalny's message, talking mostly about corruption and the injustice of the distribution of the country's wealth, Navalny at the same time was trying to promote the culture of dignity as opposed to the culture of honor, which governs people like Putin. He tried to appeal to the educated part of every Russian, to the European part of every Russian who wants not so much to live like those oligarchs, but to live a decent life of dignity, where there is an equality of opportunity for everyone. Remember the American ideal? Equality of opportunity is above all. He appealed to those who are already Europeans, partially or quite a lot. So these Russians are part of this European culture. They don't want to live in conspicuous consumption. That's not for them. They actually despise these golden chains and magenta jackets. They don't want to have a big palace. They want to live decent life in order to be creative, in order to bring up children who will live in a different world. They want to travel. They're very much part of that world which is described by people like Richard Florida, etc., talking about creative industries, when people's currency is not so much gold and dollars as accumulating impressions and trying to share that. So the culture of sharing with others. So that's the essence of Putin, of Navalny's anti-corruption corruption message, I think. And Russia was on the way to become this European culture, and they could really develop strong democracy, if not for this very cunning way of mafia state of doing things gradually. So they very gradually stole away one thing after the other. In the early 2000s, it's clearly documented how the legal system was changed, the court system was changed, the power was taken from the regions, particularly under the pretext of the terrorist attack in Beslan, but actually it was prepared before that attack, so we don't know, maybe the attack was prepared in order to conceal that plan or to justify that plan. We don't know that. So talking about that civic movement, which culminated first in 2011 in December, and Ilya was, of course, a very noticeable part of that. But that momentum continued despite the tightening of the bolts. We have to remember that when in January 2021 people took to the streets, there was already incomparably much more against them, threatening them. COVID restrictions, for example, that was already enough to arrest you. Well, it's okay if Putin conducts a huge rally in the stadium, but for you, we have the same law, but we will enforce it because we can. And compared to the turbulent winter of 2011 and 2012, comparable number of people came out to the streets. And not only in the COVID situation, but only the situation when they knew perfectly well that now they can be repressed much more easily. So this continued and continued. This simply shows that the potential of these people, into which Alexei Navalny believed while pushing his anti-corruption message, so that potential was there, and it actually hasn't disappeared. And what the resistance, which has so many interesting forms abroad, including the initiative of this House, that's what this resistance should do. Not to forget that the majority of people who think like us, incomparable majority, they're still in Russia for various reasons. They can't leave the country. I don't know if I answered that question. Maybe there is one moment which I should...
Oh, I think we'll talk more then afterwards, as I'm conscious that people can ask questions. My last question. So I think it is really important, and that carries on the previous one. You were saying during your presentation that you don't take Putin as imperialist. There's like he's a greedy guy, wants to enjoy life, and he's not an imperialist. I agree with you. I think that he's ideophobic. He is no Hitler, but I'm very much afraid that non-imperialist Putin is actually making very imperialist Russia, playing with people's emotions, playing with people's poverty, playing with their frustration, manipulating because he's a brilliant manipulator. And as a result, we see in the polls 70% people who support the war. It's not that they're enthusiastic about the war. You know, supporting the war doesn't mean that they're going to the front lines to fight. But they kind of support everything that Putin is doing. And because of that, they become part of the imperialist agenda of the authorities, which the postmodernist elites are not taking serious for themselves, but the population actually takes it pretty serious. And again, touching the issue of the Russian opposition, I think that there is a very clear, with a 70% divide, and that's applicable to many of our colleagues, is that one thing is not to support the war and criticize the war and wish for the war to be over. A very different thing is to agree into a defeat of Russia. I think these are totally different things. And I think that the majority of people, when they would be facing a choice between ending of war and letting Russia being defeated, they would rather choose continuation of the war than the defeat of Russia. Again, would you agree to this? And don't you think that presents a fundamental challenge for building normal, democratic, free society?
Well, thank you for that question, Ilya. The sociological answer is we don't know. First of all, when you look at the polling results from Russia, remember what I said. That's the only success Mr. Putin has achieved. Trying to persuade you that there are some 70%, like Ilya just said, who support the war. If you look at the same polling results from a different angle, you will see that the majority of people want the war to be over. Even Vtsiom says that. Even Fedorov, the Kremlin who participate in a survey, 18 out of 20 say no, we don't want to participate. Those who do agree, what do you think they will answer? If they organize an opinion poll in prison, what do you think about the prison head? Or it really reminds me of the famous scene from Подкидыш, from the Lost Girl comedy from the 1930s. Девочка, ты хочешь на дачу или что тебе оторвали голову? My little girl, do you want to go to dacha with us? Or we tear your head off? На дачу. That's what Russian people say. Indeed, it's quite clear that people didn't like the idea of mobilization, or as Putin called it, partial mobilization. Again, this is a market economy. This is a consumerist society. People want to live their ordinary lives. They want to carry on and on and on. We cannot really say, would they be really glad if the war will be over thanks to Russia's defeat? We don't have the means, we don't have the instrument of measuring that. We can say for sure that these people don't want to go back to the Soviet deficit. These people don't want mobilization. Nobody wants to fight except those who are in desperate situations. And these resources are being almost finished now for Putin. Just remember the story of North Korean soldiers. And they definitely want peace. By any measurement, through different polls, we can see that. There are other sociological methods. One of them is called list experiments, when you sometimes ask questions in one form, the whole list of questions, an incomplete list of questions. You exclude something very sensitive, and then you compare the results. And then it becomes clear that people don't support Putin as much as the war. It's a more subtle sociological technique, but it's quantitative method. There are also qualitative methods. I'm part of that professionally. When you talk to people, And in this regard, I would recommend the massive work conducted by the team of my younger colleagues called Public Sociology Lab. They've already conducted 3 waves of extensive, in-depth study of what Russians feel during the time of war. They specifically focused towards the end on those Russians who appear to be supportive of the war. And when they talk to these people, it's a totally different situation. You try to understand people's motivation, why they think so. When people just tick the boxes during mass opinion polls, it doesn't really show the reality to you. And on the other hand, I want to go back to Ilya's idea that in the 1990s there was a significant part of our population who thought like criminals. People, maybe not 20%, but a significant proportion of people had gone through the Russian detention system and correctional institutions. That's why it's no wonder that in the late 1990s, one of the most popular radio stations was called Radio Chanson. And in future, looking back retrospectively, you understand that was one of the elements of that capital Putin used in order to scratch the wound. Again, I used one image of cancer cells. You can try and live such a life so that you prevent cancer from developing, like don't smoke, for example. And the other thing is that you can use the image of scratching the wound, or tiny something on your skin. You have the choice of not scratching them, and this will not develop into something horrible. But Putin knew what to do. He scratched that. He scratched this radio chanson, so to speak. And he tried to bring forward those imperialistic emotions which exist everywhere. They exist among the French, they exist among the Germans, as we can see. AfD is a good reminder of that. It even exists in a different form, maybe not imperialistic, but in some other form in this society. So the life of the late Soviet Union and the troubles of post-Soviet existence should be a good reminder to the free world, including America, what can be done if you don't fight for democracy every day. This is very important.
Thank you very much. So opening for questions, you were first, then, okay. So,
I'm a Kashmiri, and I want independent Kashmir from India and Pakistan. But you know, it's very difficult to have independence without having superpower behind you very strongly. Pakistan came into existence only because Harry Truman and Winston Churchill wanted to fight a war with USSR, because Western world knew that there is going to be a war. So now the thing is this: how do you get US support? I have worked on both sides of the aisle. I worked for Democrat member of Congress, then I worked for RNC, and I can tell you on the basis of my experience, the minute you write a check, they even forget your name. They don't know much, you know, what you are talking about. You would be wasting your time. So without getting US strong support, do you think that your struggle would be fruitful? Especially in the era of Trump, who really doesn't feel very strongly about your cause. And I'm a Trump supporter. I'm a Republican, and I personally believe in him. And I believe his philosophy that we have no business to waste our time and waste our dollars abroad. He did the best thing. I mean, I know you are going to feel offended, but he did the best thing by asking Europeans buy these weapons from us and then send it to Ukraine. So I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend you, but this is the reality of life. He is a businessman. So I don't want to ramble, but I hope.
Well, thank you very much for bringing up that point. I think in some ways, maybe in many ways, we have a chance now compared to the situation right at the beginning of the war. I don't agree that the war happened because of Biden and Democrats. It happened because of Putin. But the war has a chance to be stopped in a way which somehow approximates the understanding that I'm trying to explain. Don't fear, don't trust, don't ask. Не верь, не бойся, не проси is the old wisdom from the times of thieves in law, воров в законе, and the height of Stalinism. Don't take Putin as your equal. Don't consider him the leader of a major nation. He's a thug. He's someone who disrespects international norms. Your question was whether or not we can manage with the US without the US support. We cannot be fully sure. Europe is stronger than sometimes we think. Europe is capable of producing arms far superseding the capability of Putin's Russia. What can really rescue Russia, rescue Putin, let's not confuse Putin and Russia, is only China. Even in a kind of covert, massive financial support scheme. That's the only possibility for Putin to really fence off serious pressure from the West. We are talking about not sending European, not to mention American soldiers to Ukraine. God forbid Russia. So we can envisage a very serious, proactive, as I explained, not reactive, but proactive response of Europe, even in the situation when America backs off. But we can see that there are other stimuli in this country. First of all, the fact that the majority of American population supports Ukraine. Let's not forget that. The majority of Trump supporters support Ukraine. So the best possible scenario, maybe not the absolute best, but quite an optimal scenario is that America at least doesn't lose the grip. America should stay involved and maybe go a little bit beyond supplying a few Patriot missiles. So yeah, America plays still a huge role. But the world has become so complicated, and Europe has every potential now to become a real world power if America slips into isolationism, which would be a huge mistake to the detriment of America itself.
Thank you.
I just have a short comment. I think we should not think much about Putin's suicide. So Hitler committed suicide when it was inevitable for him to be captured by Red Army physically. Similarly, Putin can do it only when he's to be about captured by other people, but it will happen beyond the critical point when change starts. By this time, everything will be already clear. He will be defeated. So furthermore, I would say thinking too much about his possible suicide is a too defensive position for the opposition. We should be more progressive towards depriving him from the power.
Andrei, thank you, but I should remind you that at the very beginning of the war, there were two opposites of the popular discourse and the political discourse, Western political discourse about Putin and how the war will end. One extreme was that he's just a madman. He's irrational. How could he attack Ukraine, etc.? After 3 years, we understand he was not such a maniac. Well, he can be manic in other ways, like maniacally pursuing domination, etc. But not in that regard. He's quite rational, but he has his own rational will. So the other extreme at the time was, oh, they will soon depose Putin, he will be just assassinated. Well, we have seen that he's not going to be assassinated because there's a system. There's a market economy which is still there, which helped to survive under sanctions, and that there are people who have too much to lose at the moment. But I'm talking about Putin's suicide not as about a defensive strategy for an opposition. Well, first of all, I remind you, there's no opposition, there's resistance. For them, it's really foolish to think that tomorrow there will be no Putin. I'm talking about the situation of Putin being cornered. It doesn't matter. Will he be cornered like a, so to speak, Red Army or Ukrainian soldiers? Very unlikely. Ukrainians don't want it. But the internal pressures and the internal tensions will bring about the situation, quite possibly, when he will be surrounded in his bunker. And who will be against him? Of course, those who the best instruments of keeping him in power, the same FSB officers, the same Patrushev who wants his son to prosper in future capitalist Russia. It's pretty clear. Only one person is to that degree mad. He's not mad. He simply wants to leave this world in a most painless way. Why I'm talking about Putin's suicide? In order not to produce a strategy for defensive strategy for those who are against Putin. I'm trying to explain that one should not be afraid of other massive attacks by Putin. So if we are at all talking about Chekhov's gun, that there will be some use of nuclear charge, then it will be Putin's suicide. In the situation when he's absolutely cornered, and the next moment he will be torn apart, impaled or flayed or God knows what, humiliated previously by those who betray him. In order to avoid that and not to bring up that suicide and possible elimination of loss of lives of thousands of Russians, I think there are certain mechanisms. Putin cannot really rely on his generals and FSB top ranks to negotiate his peaceful retirement. I would entertain the idea of Santa Lina II, to flatter Putin with this comparison to Napoleon, who was exiled to Santa Lina Island eventually. That's where he died. It was a face-saving strategy, first of all by the Brits, but also by the Russians and Austrians and Prussians. Yeah. So what is better, to commit the act of revenge on Putin and organize a phenomenal spectacle of bringing him to a new...
I like your idea with nuclear device. It would be fun.
Yeah, well, I'm against killing thousands of Muscovites, okay? So that's why I think
Новая Земля is
a
a
good
great
idea
place.
to use Chubais and Kudrin and maybe Abramovich. There are very few people whom Putin trusts that they would organize this type of peace talks. Of course, first of all, he has to be defeated on the battlefield in Ukraine, fully defeated. And then some irreversible processes for him of losing power will start to unfold in Russia. This is something which can eventually bring Putin to a negotiation table. All that we hear today is all impression management. You can't believe that. It took Trump too long to understand that. But, well, fortunately, we see some signs of better understanding. Now, Kudrin, Chubais, Voloshin, Abramovich could be those, unlike the generals, whom Putin will never trust. And they cannot engage with Western leaders in understanding and bringing up to his mind this understanding. Stop it. No longer fight your Russians. You already lost in Ukraine. You are now being inevitably surrounded. You will lose your life. Don't use your nuclear, portable, tactical weapon. Just go to the island in the Pacific, I call it Santa Lina II, and live there in your golden palace. Beautiful life. I personally prefer that to the risk of losing too many lives. This is a new philosophical problem which kind of undermines the idea of justice, because we have this example of Nuremberg trials as a pinnacle of justice. I think new humanity is about not putting justice above humanity and humanism. Even if the most evil person in the world is isolated in that manner, it's better. What we need to do instead is to work on the justice for the Russian people. Work on the future Russia without Putin and Putinism. Without Putin, there will be no Putinism. That's my sociological conviction. Or there will be some other form which will no longer be Putinism, because it's highly personalistic. Yes, so yeah, we have to wrap up with that. So that's my answer. Not being defensive, but being really proactive, trying to explain. Don't be afraid. Don't fear nuclear escalation. The worst thing that can happen is Putin killing himself using nuclear weapon.
I'll go to the next question.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I have maybe 2-3 questions, but before I ask them, I like the song. I'm going to watch the whole thing. I did not understand a thing, but thank you for the translation. It has a really good beat. Anyhow, a couple of questions. One, do you think Trump really understands Putin? Second one is, I forgot his name, but he was marching towards Moscow and he retreated, and then flight accident, which was not an accident, of course. That is one example, and the other one is Navalny. Did they not know what could happen? How do you read them? How do you interpret what they did, Navalny and that guy? Okay, that's my second question. And the other one is,
I'll try to remember.
Yeah, my other one is, what is preventing Ukraine from basically eliminating him, taking him out? Take Putin out.
I'll start with the last thing. Not only Ukraine eliminating Putin, but any kind of political association is mostly in the past because we are too humanistic. Nothing is too humanistic on the one hand. On the other hand, it's a sign of our progress. I don't want to indulge in too much Pinkerism, if you know who Steven Pinker is. But I think, yes, this is very important. And this actually goes in parallel with my idea of St. Helena 2 for Putin instead of Nuremberg trial 2. But it's indeed true. We are against depriving even the most evil person of his life. So I don't know what should happen if we so that we go back to our emotional structure of the late last months of the Second World War. Of course, there was a pivotal moment, I call it Casablanca moment, in January 1943, when Roosevelt and Churchill got together and decided this guy should be eliminated. We can see some parallels with the Second World War and Hitler, but we live in a totally different world. We understand much better that it shouldn't be done because it can be done then to anybody. So there should be some more humanistic ways of solving that. This is one side of the problem. The other, we are too humanistic. Second side is it falls within the realm of economic sociology. Economic sociology is not about economy. It's about weighing pros and cons in any actions. There are too many people surrounding Putin right now who will not let it happen. And the Ukrainians simply do not have those resources to organize Putin's assassination. He's not only the richest person in human history. Forget about Elon Musk. It's Putin who is the richest person in human history. And he's not only the richest, he's also the most expensive. And the huge part of that expense is his personal security. You can say that this system of security, since it's so complex, can be more easily breached. And you saw that moment, and you rightly point out at Prigozhin and his march on Moscow. So Navalny, on the one hand, was the beacon for Biden and others who didn't follow it. They should have not engaged in any kinds of talks with Putin, just saying, you're not what you're trying to pretending to be. And we are not talking to you. Release Navalny first. In Prigozhin's case, it's also another testimony of the fact that Putin's mafia rule system is weak. It can be easily undermined in a critical situation. But to create such a critical situation, certain efforts should be made. Let's not forget that Prigozhin's march happened still at the time when we were thinking about possible successful Ukrainian offensive in the summer of 2023, following the success of the fall 2022, the liberation of Kherson and Kharkiv region. So that was a different set of factors at that moment, which means that another constellation of factors can come into force again.
Okay, next question.
Okay, may I start? Yeah, first of all, thank you so much.
And I propose that we collect probably then all the questions, because
Then I need to write down.
Yeah, I saw here five hands, because we're really already starting to run out of time.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Anton. First of all, I want to thank you for such thoughtful conversation, and I want to thank you, Ilya, for making possible to have such different opinions here. And even this little disagreement shows that democracy is in place here. So my question is short. Do you think that Putin truly believes that he's surrounded by enemies such as collective West and the United States, or it's such a tool to use for its people, Russian citizens, to keep them in fear and then manipulate their opinions? Yeah, do you want me to repeat the question, or? Yeah. So, do you believe that Putin? Do you think that Putin truly believes that he's surrounded by common West, by the enemies and the United States, or it's just a tool to use to manipulate Russian citizens to kind of plant the fear inside of their minds, and then, like you mentioned, that the people are gonna give up their responsibility and just trust their leader?
There's a minority of people in the national security community who believe that the United States' support for Ukraine and Israel in the Middle East is drawing resources, military and other human national security resources, away from the greatest strategic threat to the United States, which is China. And so there's an argument that's made that we need to isolate China, and one way to do it is to put pressure on Ukraine to basically sue for peace and give in to Putin's demands, and no NATO, no foreign troops on the territory, the 4 oblasts or 5 or whatever the number of oblasts that Putin decides he wants, give to them. And that would enable the United States and Russia, or Putin in this case, to engage in greater cooperation across a variety of fronts that would basically peel Russia away from China and make it easier for the United States to counter its greatest peer competitor. So the first question is, do you believe that's possible, that the U.S. could gain some leverage with Putin in its relationship with China? The second part is, if Putin were rewarded by the West, the U.S. and Europe, forcing Ukraine to sue for peace, would that create an incentive for him to create similar special military operations or wars with Georgia, Moldova, Latvia, other countries that were, again, part of the, well, Moldova wasn't part of the Soviet Union, but other neighboring countries? Or is Ukraine special because only Ukraine presents an existential threat and Latvia doesn't, Georgia doesn't, Moldova doesn't? What is an existential threat to Putin? And if we give in on Ukraine, will he simply go out and start other wars elsewhere. Thank you.
My name is Igor Tamasov. My question is about mafia state. I understand that, mafia appeared during feudalism, and it's very characteristic for feudal societies. And the success of capturing government and indeed the state in Russia cannot be ascribed to long feudal traditions and conversely a lack of democratic traditions. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I had a question about what you spoke about the importance of delegitimizing Putin, and that if American leadership had been more strong in forcing Putin to, or at least asking Putin to release Navalny, that maybe this war would have been avoided. Being realistic now, what does it look like for American leadership, maybe a future American presidential administration, to delegitimize Putin? What methods, what rhetoric would that utilize?
Hi, mine kind of ties in with what was already asked. But I'm curious, what we really hear a lot about it is if he hadn't been stopped in Ukraine, boom, he wants to go restore the old Soviet Union or great Russian Empire. And so the question is, do you think that would happen or could happen if somehow Ukraine falls, or they, and because I've had the impression that right now he is so obsessed with Ukraine that it's all about Ukraine. Well, he can't do anything else. So yeah, right.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
I'll start answering in order. Of course, Putin knows perfectly well that he is not surrounded by enemies. This is the ideal world to which he wanted to belong, to start with. He was never a true communist. He just wanted to become a KGB officer in order to fight his own insecurity and pursue some goals of domination and profit, which came to a qualitatively different level in the 1990s, thanks to the market economy. So all this is a part of impression management and creation of artificial threats. Of course, he doesn't believe in any malignant West who wants to destroy Russia. He knows perfectly well that America in its history only saved Russia a number of times. He can push these historical facts away and try and pretend that he's developing some other history. He pretends, or rather some other people pretend, that he's influenced by Dugin or by Ilyin. He doesn't care about them. He can refer to them later when he picks up on some people's interest to that connection between him and those thinkers. He knew perfectly well before any Dugin and any Ilyin what he wanted. So now it's all aggravated by the fear of losing power and the fear that he instills among the Russians, which we should openly call terror. It's the practice of terror. Is a reflection of his personal fear. So he's fighting fire with fire. Клин клином вышибает. So Putin is trying to overcome his personal insecurities of fear and fear by instilling that fear in the Russian society. And in order to do that, he develops this discourse of Russia being surrounded by enemies. China, well, it's a somewhat subtle issue here. To ask Ukraine to surrender, just openly say, ask Ukraine to surrender in order for America and Russia to build an alliance against China is a total illusion. Russia is a minor gang member under the Pahan, under the Kapadi Tutikapi called China. China doesn't want a global conflict. They don't want to organize a nuclear Armageddon. They want to use every advantage to flourish in the global market economy. And America is a major partner for them. Let's not forget that. How Russia can be used against China, you can come up with a totally different answer. Russia can be defeated by Ukraine in this war, turn democratic, and then ally with the United States to create the complete belt of liberal democracy from Vancouver to Vladivostok. That's the answer. China is a threat to American democracy in many ways, but China is a major trade partner as well. Talking about China as a major threat can be legitimate, but it's really misleading when we overlook the immediate and direct danger, which is Russia. Let's go step by step, and let's see what is the immediate and most direct danger to liberal democracy in the world. It's not China, it's Russia, because Russia, on the one hand, is playing as a minor instrument for Chinese interests, and actually gives away many things to China for free, just in order to stay in favor of China. Possibly for China to bail out Russia financially when it comes to total critical point when Western military alliance overwhelms the Russian military production fully, which is a complete possibility. So this is the wrong way of thinking. China is not a liberal economy. So in that way, China is, of course, an opponent of the United States. But to try and think of Russia, dictatorial Russia, to turn on your side against that dictatorship, give me a break. Mafia and feudalism. Oh yeah, Putin and further whether he can be further encouraged in his aggression. You know, it's an honest answer to say that Putin hardly can do anything with Ukraine. I know that many European politicians often adopt this language of Russia. Tomorrow you will all be speaking Russian if we don't help Ukraine. Well, I like it in the way that everything should be done to mobilize the West and Europe in particular to help Ukraine. But honestly, Putin has no resources to go any further than Ukraine. Once defeated in Ukraine, that's the end of Putin's aggression anywhere else. His victory, full victory in Ukraine, is also impossible. We have seen that. The worst case scenario for Ukraine is this endless protracted war when Ukraine will be completely drained. But Russia will also be drained. Let's not forget that. Again, there is a great factor of China here. That's how two of your questions are connected. So mafia and feudalism. This is totally wrong. Mafia is not feudalism, and mafia is not a result of feudalism. Mafia is a result of modernist industrial development. It only became a reality, the same Sicilian mafia, after the advance of railway roads with the European industrialization. And mafia can only exist as a parasitic something on the body of complex modern industry and political system. Mafia needs some democracy to be present. On the one hand, we should remember, and I think Ilya reminded us of that, that mafia can be a very successful means for some cultural minorities to reach certain justice. Like in this country, Italian mafia or other mafias would effectively be instruments of conflict resolution within certain cultural communities where the American police would be helpless. So mafias had that positive function as well. But only within modern industrial economy, mafias can really exist because they are fundamentally parasitic and can only exist in that environment. How to delegitimize Putin now? It's a great question. That's why we have some chance with Trump now compared to Biden, because Biden was afraid of delegitimizing Putin, starting with the moment in the end of 2021 when he should have said to him, I'm not talking to you until Navalny is released. This delegitimization probably cannot take the form of immediately closing all the Russian embassies all around the world. But look at Lukashenko. Lukashenko is fully delegitimized. There are still Belarusian embassies in this country and all around the world, but he's no longer a legitimate president. How it can be done further, pushed further with Putin and Russia, that's a big debatable question. So we have to finally set an agenda with world leaders coming together and create a committee, anti-Putin coalition, not just pro-Ukrainian coalition, but anti-Putin coalition. And for that, what is extremely important is to distinguish Putin and the Russian people. And the last thing was about the restoration of the Soviet Union. I partially already answered. If Ukraine falls, first of all, Ukraine cannot fall. There will be a Ukraine. And thought. Again, it involves attacking Baltic states. It could be some subversive actions, of course, and they are already taking place all over Europe, we know. Putin, after his professionals were expelled from Europe, I mean KGB officers undercover, he has to use some cheaper labor, using some thugs in Europe, like in Poland and other countries. So this is possible, but an all-out war against NATO, I think, is out of question. And those who undermine our trust in Article 5 should actually stop doing that. There are multiple ways of supporting your fellow NATO country so that Putin will never dare to do that. One Ukraine is already too much for him. So that's the end of questions.
Thank you so much, Sergei. It was fascinating. But we continue informally, and as always, I am asking you not to forget about the QR code here on the wall to support the work of the House. Thank you very much.
Илья, спасибо большое за такую возможность. Хорошие вопросы. На самом деле, довольно прекрасное рождение. Это то, что мне кажется не хватает.
Every week, every 2 weeks.
Every week there's something.
Yeah. Are you in charge of that?
I'm the founder of the
Not right now. Anyway, what you're doing here,
Do you have my contacts? Do you have my contacts?
Есть российский народ, и он представлен этими людьми, а не Путиным.
Now follow up with your email.
You were just business. My business cards.
What is your job? What's that for?
Well, I live in Ukraine, and we fight. And right now, I'm involved in a lot of different defense-related projects in Ukraine.
Okay. Well, I hope Trump is finally turned in the right direction. I'm not convinced yet.
I think that it was predicted, actually. We started this house, it was the election night. It was our first event, it was when the election night. There was a discussion here. Everything is